you guys, or perhaps I should say, do us guys, do we have any connections with the new mayoral administration in New York City? And more broadly, what is a relatively conservative, free market oriented institution's relationship to the structures of power in the city?
Well, this is always an area where you want to tread lightly because we are, of course, a nonpartisan organization, but we do work with public officials of any partisan coloration, of any ideological coloration, and I will say that our current mayor, Mayor Adams, is someone who I believe has the right priorities. I think that he recognizes that New York City both has an enormous opportunity, but also faces a lot of pretty profound challenges. Public safety being issue number one, I would say that his perspective on these issues, is broadly aligned with ours. And I will say that again, this is true of many different public officials, but we certainly make an effort to be a resource. But also, these are public officials we're hearing from range of different voices. I say this, Glenn, because the environment that we're in. I certainly would not want it to be said that Mayor Adams marches in lockstep with this or that right-wing institution. I certainly don't think that's true. But I also think that he's someone who is very sensitive to evidence. He is someone who also recognizes that the constituency that was a very core part of his electoral coalition, and that is a constituency that I think that he is pretty attuned to. Working class, lower middle class people living the outer boroughs of New York City in particular. Many of them Black, many of them coming from communities that have been historically disadvantaged. I think that he understands something that many other politicians do not understand. Politicians, whether they're Democratic, Republican, you name it, which is that these are communities that care very deeply about public safety, because they see it as foundational. If you do not feel safe, it is exceedingly difficult to build a flourishing life. This work very well, Glenn. In fact, a lot of this work is work that I was introduced to through your work. But the threat of violence hanging over you has a pretty profound effect on cognitive outcomes, on labor market outcomes. You and I were talking about the work of Elijah Anderson not long ago. And there's a way in which, when you're talking about, very violent neighborhoods, there's a stigma associated with being from those communities, whether or not you're a participant in that violence. And I would say that, this long period that unfortunately seems to have come to an end, but this long crime decline we've seen in our major cities, I actually think was in some ways a very good one for fostering social ties across racial lines and ethnic lines. It was actually a time when, when you feel this greater sense of safety, it makes people less defensive. It means that actually people are willing to kind of come out of that defensive crouch that a lot of people are in communities that are scarred by violence. So anyway, I just think that that's extremely central and profound. And I believe that Mayor Adams feels the same way. I believe that, the mayor feels hamstrung by basically forces that, this sounds like excuse making, but I think it's true. There are things that are happening in Albany in the state legislature. There are decisions that are being made by prosecutors that will really determine the success or failure of his project to restore public order and to combat serious violence in the poorest, most dangerous neighborhoods in New York City. And by the way, New York City has it good relative to a lot of other cities. Even now, even though you've seen this incredible deterioration, I have a lot of family in Louisville, Kentucky, and that's a city that in some ways is a great story. It's a city where e-commerce has created a lot of great blue collar employment opportunities. It's a place that has a low cost of living. It's a place where really it's possible to climb from the working class to the middle class. But if you're living in the west side of Louisville, if you're living in these neighborhoods that I'm sorry to say are heavily Black, very poor, where you have a lot of multi-generational poverty, these are places that have gotten a lot more violent in recent years, and they've been violent for a long time. if you're looking at Baltimore, you're just looking at so many cities around the country that were already struggling, even during that era when a lot of cities were getting much better. You're seeing backsliding. So anyway, I've gone far afield from Mayor Adams, but the short of it with Mayor Adams is that he, to me, is someone who represents something that could be incredibly important in democratic politics, and that's one reason why I really want to see him succeed.
Democratic, small d.
Well, actually, yes. So let me take off my leader of an institution hat and say yes, small d, but also capital D. Capital D because I'll just lay my cards on the table. I think that there is this sense, particularly for people who are highly, highly partisan, that, the other side is so bad that I actually want them to get worse because, I want my side to win and it's going to be easier if they get worse. And that is not my thinking. I believe that, Democrats are going to be in charge. Republicans are going to be in charge. We want good, thoughtful, responsible, pragmatic people, people I might disagree with on many issues, but, to have that kernel. And so when it comes to democratic politics, I'm very struck by the fact that you do seem to have, and this is an oversimplification, but you do seem to have this very big gap between working and middle class Black and brown Democrats and the sensibilities of the kind of people who dominate the kind of policymaking elite of the party. And so to the extent you can have people who really have strong, deep roots in communities of color, when, more broadly, but, being from New York City, that's something I kind of tend to gravitate towards. And who can speak credibly. Peter Scarry, who's a friend of yours and a friend of mine, once made this brilliant observation just about how when you look at advocacy organizations, they're oftentimes led by people who, are typically educated, upper middle income people. And even if they come from, non-white groups, from minority groups, they feel this legitimacy crisis. Well, am I truly authentic if I'm someone who, has these credentials and kind of travel in this integrated world? So the way that they establish their bona fides is by making maximal demands. How can I be as radical as possible? How can I, kind of be as transgressive, in a safe way, in my kind of elite discourse as possible? Whereas you have a lot of people that they're ostensibly speaking for who are like, I just want safe streets, I just, kind of want to be able to go to a decent school. I just want these very practical things. And so there's this big disconnect there. And I think it's a big problem for our politics. And it's a big problem when you think about this question of representation and representativeness. And anyway, it's something that I think about a lot. And that's why I think a lot about people who have the moral authority or believe themselves to have the moral authority to dissent. Because I think that those dissenters oftentimes, this is a very familiar idea to you and to your listeners, but they actually speak in some ways more authentically, for working class, middle class communities. It is just, my perception. And I think that transmission belt, the brokenness of that transmission belt is a big problem for our public discourse.